Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for your ears. The story of the Randolph wedding in Annapolis is not just a local legend, not just a forgotten piece of colonial history. It is a blueprint, a demonstration of how power, blood, and inheritance intertwine behind closed doors. The screams beneath Randolph Manor ended at 11 minutes past midnight, October 13th, 1796, but the silence that followed has lasted for centuries. Picture this. Above ground, 47 guests dancing beneath chandeliers, their laughter carried on the smell of roasted duck and spiced wine. Below them, a 19-year-old bride in a white silk gown, clawing at limestone walls with her bare hands, her fingers broken, her throat raw from screaming. Margaret Randolph, the wealthiest young woman in Annapolis. The heir to a fortune so vast it could alter the balance of families across Maryland, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. But what none of the guests knew, what even most of the servants did not realize, was that the entire wedding had been staged as a cover for her execution. Yes, you heard me, a wedding engineered as a funeral, a bride buried alive beneath her own family estate while the dance floor above became her coffin lid, and the most horrifying part, her father, her uncle, her own husband, each played a part. The families of Annapolis closed ranks in silence, sealing not only her body but the truth of her death behind stone walls and signed documents. You see, history has a habit of dressing murder in the robes of respectability. When blood is spilled by kings, by judges, by men with powdered wigs and family crests, it is no longer called murder. It is called necessity, inheritance management, reputation protection, and the screams of the victim are muted by parchment, sealed with wax, and filed away where no one dares to look. Margaret Randolph was not simply killed for money. No. Her fate was designed as a message, a warning to every woman who would inherit too much, ask too many questions, or stand too proudly in a world built by men who fed on secrets and contracts. The Randolph conspiracy was not just about one fortune, it was about control, about creating the illusion of lineage while destroying the inconvenient heirs who might disrupt the plan. Think of the detail. The lead weights sewn into her gown under the pretense of elegance, the basement constructed with walls 3 feet thick, designed not only to preserve wine but to trap sound itself, so that even the most desperate scream could not escape. The orchestration of powerful men, an attorney, a magistrate, a physician, all tied together in a pact of silence, their financial futures bound to Margaret's disappearance. It was not sloppy, it was meticulous, cold, ritualistic. And yet, the plan required something more than law and architecture. It required belief. Belief that no one in Annapolis would dare question the narrative once it was spoken by men of standing. Belief that wealth and family name could cover up the truth better than any brick wall. Belief that Margaret herself, young and trapped, would never find a way to expose them. But here's where it begins to sting. Because if you think this was just one isolated horror of the 18th century, you've missed the lesson. This is how power works, always. Hide the victim beneath the foundation, play the music louder upstairs, keep the guests fed and drunk while in the shadows the real game is played. The Randolphs were not an exception, they were a template. And if you want to understand the world you live in now, the systems that bind you, the invisible prisons, you must first walk into that basement with Margaret and see what was done to her. Before we go further, I want you to pause. Ask yourself, where are you watching this from? What state? What city? Tell me in the comments below, because the story of Margaret Randolph isn't just Annapolis's story, it's yours too. It's a story that echoes wherever families hoard wealth, wherever legacies are protected by silence, and wherever truth is buried under stone. This is the descent, and once you start walking down these stairs with me, there is no turning back. Every empire begins with a secret, and the Randolph fortune was no different. To the world, Captain James Randolph was a decorated mariner, a pioneer of Chesapeake trade, a man whose tobacco and sugar roots built the foundation of one of Maryland's most prestigious families. But underneath the polished reputation was the truth, that fortune was soaked in debts, betrayals, and quiet deals struck in smoke-filled taverns where no women or children were allowed to enter. Margaret Randolph, at just 19, was not merely an heiress. She was the inheritor of unfinished bargains. her maternal grandfather's shipping empire, her father's speculative real estate, and the entangled loans of Revolutionary War veterans all passed through her name like blood through a vein. On parchment, her life was worth over £12,000, a staggering fortune in the 1790s, enough to shift power among entire colonies. But fortune in the Randolph family was not just wealth, it was a trap. Her father, Cornelius, projected the image of a successful merchant. Fine coats, fine wines, fine words spoken at Annapolis assemblies, but behind closed doors, he was drowning. Ships captured by British privateers, loans unpaid, investments in West Indies plantations turning sour. Every year the books grew redder, and every year he mortgaged more of Margaret's inheritance to keep his illusion alive. Do you see the pattern? The wealthiest man in the room is often the one most desperate to borrow. The father who presents strength at the table is the one most enslaved by creditors whispering threats in alleys. Cornelius was not protecting Margaret. He was protecting himself from bankruptcy, from debtor's prison, from the shame of collapse. And when men like Cornelius are cornered, they turn their daughters into collateral. It is here that Thomas Carrington entered the story. A man who, to polite society, appeared every inch the Virginia gentleman, tall, well-mannered, confident, a tobacco merchant of enviable standing. But in truth, Thomas Carrington did not exist. His real name was Thomas Garrett, a runaway servant, a fraud, a predator who had studied the habits of gentlemen like a hunter studying prey. He forged letters, polished his accent, and with every glass of port he bought on borrowed credit, he became the perfect illusion. When Garrett, now Carrington, set his eyes on Margaret, he saw not a woman but a vault guarded by her father's desperation and unlocked only through marriage. And Cornelius, drowning in debt, saw in Thomas not a liar but a lifeline. Their conspiracy was born not from love, not from family loyalty, but from the hunger of two desperate men who saw a young bride as nothing more than a key to their survival. But they needed more than desperation. They needed a system, a network, a doctor to falsify the papers, a lawyer to move the assets, a magistrate to silence questions. Each man who joined the plot had something to lose: gambling debts, professional ruin, dangerous secrets. And each man agreed, because in the end, Margaret was not seen as a human being, she was a solution. Understand this: evil rarely appears in the form of one villain. Evil, true evil, is a committee. Its signatures on parchment, sealed with wax. It's the nodding agreement of men in powdered wigs who tell themselves they are simply managing an unfortunate necessity. Margaret's death was not planned in rage. It was drafted like a contract. Reviewed, revised, finalized. The house itself became a participant in the conspiracy. Randolph Manor, sitting high above the Severn River, with its 30 rooms and limestone basement. That basement, cold, damp and soundproof, was designed to store wine, but in the minds of Cornelius and his co-conspirators it became someplace else, a vault for silence, a place where truth could be bricked in forever. Margaret, intelligent and inquisitive, grew up exploring every creaking floorboard, every hidden passage. She knew the house better than anyone. And yet, the very walls that had once been her playground would become her tomb. The foundation that held her childhood would hold her screams. And this, my friend, is where the descent begins to sharpen. Because Margaret was not naive, she began to notice the silences when she entered rooms, the glances exchanged between her father and her fiancé, the documents thrust in front of her with vague explanations. Her instincts screamed, but in a world where a daughter's voice weighed less than a signature, her intelligence became her curse. She knew something was wrong, but she did not yet know how deep the conspiracy reached. So I'll ask you now, before we go further down these stairs, if you were in Margaret's position, what would you have done? Trusted your father? Fled into the night? Or smiled at the banquet table pretending to celebrate while the men around you measured the weight of your coffin dress? The truth is, most men never ask these questions until it's too late, and that is why the world keeps burying the inconvenient alive. October 13th, 1796. The date of the wedding, the date of the execution. From the moment Margaret Randolph opened her eyes that morning, she felt it. Something was wrong. Not the nervous excitement of a bride, but the heavy dread of a prisoner waiting for the cell door to close. For weeks she had been haunted by nightmares, dreams of being trapped in darkness, her hands raw from clawing at stone walls while voices whispered her name from behind them. She dreamt of water filling her lungs, of weight dragging her down, always the same voices, always the same suffocating silence after her cries. On the morning of her wedding, the dream returned with terrifying clarity. She woke drenched in sweat, her heart racing as if she had been running for her life. As the maid helped her dress, Margaret noticed something strange. Her gown, passed down through 3 generations of Randolph brides, had been altered, not for beauty, not for fit, but for control. Sewn into the hem and sleeves were small lead weights, concealed, invisible, but she could feel them pulling on her with every movement. The explanation, whispered by her maid with trembling lips, was that her father insisted it would make the gown hang more elegantly. Margaret knew better. The weights were not for elegance, they were for drowning. That morning the weather mirrored her heart. The Chesapeake wind blew sharp and cold, rattling the windows of Randolph Manor. The sky was a dull pewter, the kind of color that makes every shadow look heavier. The trees outside had already surrendered most of their leaves, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers, and inside the manor, preparations were frantic, not joyful. The decorations, the food, the music, all perfect, all hollow. The house hummed with a strange energy, as though everyone present was hiding something. By mid-morning, the guests began to arrive, 47 in all, prominent families of Annapolis, merchants, lawyers, planters. They came dressed in their finest, bringing with them smiles and polite words. Yet Margaret noticed their smiles never reached their eyes. Some guests looked at her with pity, as though they knew something she did not. Some looked away too quickly, unwilling to meet her gaze. It was a celebration, yes, but one weighted with a silence too heavy for music to conceal. The ceremony itself passed like a dream. Reverend Jonathan Miles, who had known Margaret since childhood, stood before her with the open Bible. His words blurred together. She could barely hear them. She felt the lead gown pulling her down, every vow like a chain tightening around her throat. Thomas Carrington, her husband now, sweated profusely despite the cool October air. His voice cracked when he promised to protect her until death. Margaret's father stood beside him, distracted, constantly checking his watch. Her uncle Edmund lingered in the back, pale and grim. Dr. Henley and Magistrate Brackenridge exchanged glances across the room. The men who had already signed her fate stood like executioners in disguise. The reception followed with food, wine, and dancing. Oysters, roasted duck, corn pudding, all her favorites, as though mocking her. Yet Margaret had no appetite. Every movement felt heavier, every laugh forced, every congratulation like the whisper of a gravedigger. She began to overhear fragments of conversation, guests talking about leaving town quickly, citing urgent business. It was unusual, suspicious. Why would so many people already plan their departure before the wedding feast was over? And then, the discovery. Margaret stepped away into her father's study to retrieve a handkerchief when she heard them, her father, Thomas, and her uncle Edmund, speaking through the wall. Their voices were low, but the words "P" pierced her like a blade. "The basement is prepared," her father said. "The wine barrels moved, the limestone walls will hold." Edmund's voice followed, confident. 3 feet thick. A cannon could fire down there and no one upstairs would hear. Thomas's reply trembled. "Are you sure no sound can escape?" Her blood turned cold. They were not speaking of storage. They were speaking of her. Her father continued. "We'll tell the guests she's faint, that she's gone to rest. By morning the story of her lover will be in place. When the body is found in the river, weighted down, it will look like shame drove her to it, and Thomas will be the grieving widower." The truth crashed down on her. The dress, the basement, the strange glances, the pity, the whispers. Every piece fit. They were going to bury her alive beneath the house while the guests danced above. The inheritance, the debts, the lies, all tied together in her suffocation. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, her body trembling, fighting to hear every word. She knew her life depended on understanding their plan in full. When the conversation ended and footsteps approached, she scrambled, pretending to search the desk for her handkerchief. Thomas entered, smiling that charming smile she now saw as nothing but the grin of a predator. "There you are, my dear," he said. "The guests are asking for you." Margaret forced herself to smile back, though inside she knew she was already walking toward her tomb. The music grew louder as the afternoon bled into evening. Fiddles screeched, boots stomped on polished wood floors, laughter rang out, but to Margaret every sound felt like the drumming of a funeral march. She moved through the reception like an actress trapped in a nightmare play, smiling when expected, bowing her head gracefully, answering the compliments of guests who seemed to look through her as if she were already a ghost. Everywhere she turned, she saw the faces of conspirators. Her father, Cornelius, laughing too loudly at trivial remarks, but with eyes that flicked constantly toward the clock. Her husband, Thomas, his hand resting too tightly on her arm, his smile frozen, the sweat on his brow betraying nerves he could not mask. Her uncle Edmund keeping to the edges of the room, his hand twitching as though the dice of his gambling tables were still rolling in his head. Dr. Henley nodding politely to guests while clutching a glass of brandy too tightly. Magistrate Brackenridge standing stiff, his face pale, as though his very soul recoiled from the act he was about to condone. And then there were the others, the guests who were not directly part of the scheme but complicit through silence. Some glanced at Margaret with something like pity, others with cold indifference. None spoke the truth, none intervened. Here is a secret of human nature. When evil is dressed in fine clothes and served with sweet wine, most people will look away. They will dance harder, laugh louder, drink deeper, anything to avoid acknowledging the rot beneath the floorboards. Margaret knew this now. She was alone. She tried to think of escape. Perhaps she could slip into the night, run into the forest surrounding Randolph Manor, but she wore a gown weighted with lead. Every step was heavy, clumsy, designed to slow her. Even if she reached the woods, her husband would call her hysterica. Her father would summon men to fetch her back. Her words would be twisted into nonsense by the very men who held the law in their pockets. She had no allies, no voice that could outweigh the lies already prepared for her. So she did what only the intelligent can do in the face of a trap. She pretended. She smiled. She laughed. She allowed Thomas to lead her through the traditional dances. She played the role of bride, even as her heart thundered like a drum. But in her mind she was memorizing everything, the glances exchanged, the timing of her father's movements, the way the servants carried trays toward the basement staircase as though preparing the ground. She was collecting knowledge, the one weapon still left to her. The evening grew darker. Candles were lit, casting flickering shadows across the ornate Georgian walls. The music swelled, guests grew drunk, and the conspirators waited. Margaret could see it in their faces. They were timing the moment, watching the rhythm of the celebration. Soon. Very soon. And then it came. The shift. Thomas leaned close to her, his voice low and honeyed. "My love, you seem pale. The heat of the dancing has wearied you. Perhaps some cool air will help." His eyes gleamed with rehearsed concern. Her father nodded across the room, signaling with a barely perceptible gesture. Edmund excused himself from a card game and drifted toward the stairwell. Brackenridge slipped quietly into the corner, his hand brushing against the outline of tools hidden beneath his coat. Margaret's heart pounded, but she forced her lips into a smile. "Yes," she replied softly, "perhaps a moment of rest." Together, Thomas led her toward the far end of the manor, where the staircase descended into the limestone basement. Guests barely noticed, caught in the swell of the music. To them it was nothing, a bride stepping away to catch her breath. To Marguerite, each step downward was a tolling bell, each candle-lit shadow a warning. The air grew colder as they descended, damp, heavy, the sound of laughter from above muffled by stone. Margaret glanced behind her, catching sight of Cornelius and Edmund following at a distance. She knew then, this was the moment, the trap was closing. The basement awaited, prepared not as a wine cellar but as a tomb. The barrels had been moved. The limestone walls glistened with moisture, and in the far corner where the foundation met the bluff, an open space had been cleared, large enough for a human body to stand. large enough for a wall of bricks to seal her in. Margaret stopped at the threshold, her breath caught in her throat. The smell of damp stone filled her lungs. She turned her eyes toward Thomas. For the first time since the ceremony, she allowed the mask to slip. Her gaze was steady, sharp. She wanted him to see. She knew. She knew everything. And Thomas, for the briefest moment, faltered. His smile quivered, his grip on her arm tightened. Behind them, Cornelius spoke, his voice low, commanding. "It is time." The descent was slow, deliberate, and heavy with finality. Each step into the basement felt like walking deeper into the grave. The air grew colder still, the sound of celebration upstairs muted to a distant hum, as though another world existed above, one she would never touch again. Margaret's gown dragged against the stone floor, the hidden lead weights pulling her down like chains of the damned. Thomas guided her by the arm, but his grip was iron, not gentle. Behind them came Cornelius, her father, whose face was grim, eyes fixed not on her, but on the cleared corner of the cellar. Edmund followed with a lantern, the weak flame illuminating stacks of displaced barrels, piles of bricks, and buckets of mortar. Brackenridge was already waiting, his coat removed, sleeves rolled to his elbows, tools gleaming in the lantern light. Dr. Henley lingered in the shadows, arms folded, eyes downcast, as though wishing the role he had accepted would not stain his hands. Margaret's breath quickened, her pulse roared in her ears, but she did not scream, she did not beg. She stood tall, even as her knees trembled beneath the gown, for in that moment she understood something most never realize until it is too late. Fear is their weapon, but defiance is the only weapon left to you when the world conspires against your life. "Father," she said, her voice steady though her heart thundered, "what is this? What madness do you bring me to?" Cornelius's eyes flicked toward her but did not soften. "Do not fight, Margaret. It must be done." His words were quiet, practiced, as if rehearsed countless times. "Your legacy will not go to waste. You will save this family, though you do not yet understand it." "Save?" she spat. "Save? You would bury me alive in my own house and call it salvation?" Thomas's hand tightened on her arm. "Margaret." She turned her eyes on him then, and the rage in her gaze burned through his charm. "You, a liar, a thief. You think wearing a gentleman's coat makes you a man? You are nothing but a fraud who hides behind shadows." For a moment, silence fell. Even Brackenridge paused, the trowel in his hand frozen in the air. Edmund shifted uneasily, his gambler's soul recoiling at her defiance. But Cornelius broke the silence, his voice like stone grinding on stone. "Begin." Brackenridge set the first brick on the damp floor with a thud. The sound echoed like a death knell. He spread the mortar with calm efficiency. A second brick followed, then a third. The rhythm of construction began, the slow building of her tomb. Margaret stepped back against the wall, her silk gown pressing against the cold limestone. She raised her chin, eyes fixed on the men sealing her fate. "The world will know," she said, her voice cutting the silence. "You think stone can silence me? You think money can erase me? You will choke on this secret. Every brick you lay will weigh on your souls until the grave takes you." Thomas flinched at her words. Edmund's hand trembled on the lantern, but Cornelius did not waver. He watched with cold resolve, his debts and shame greater than his fatherly love. As the wall grew higher, Margaret's breaths grew sharper, her chest rising and falling with defiant fury. She slammed her fists against the bricks, the sound muffled, yet her voice carried. "I curse this house, I curse this family. May every laugh above be drowned in my silence below." Above, the music thundered on. Fiddles screamed, boots pounded, guests toasted with wine, oblivious that the bride they toasted was being bricked alive beneath their feet. The celebration became the mask of the murder, the laughter of Annapolis society burying one of its own. When the wall reached her chest, Margaret's strength turned desperate. She clawed at the mortar with tore and nails, her white gown streaked with dust and blood. Her cries grew raw, her voice a mixture of fury and terror. She slammed her fists until the skin split, but still the wall rose. Brick by brick, the conspirators erased her. Brick by brick, her inheritance, her future, her very breath was suffocated beneath the stone of her father's house. And when the wall reached her face, Margaret Randolph screamed, not only with the fear of death, but with the fury of betrayal. It was not the scream of a weak victim. It was the scream of a curse hurled across centuries, a soundless vow to haunt the bloodlines of every man who sealed her fate. The final brick was set. The lantern flame flickered as the mortar spread, and then the silence. But upstairs the music continued. The dance floor shook, the laughter roared, the guests celebrated, never knowing they were stomping their feet upon the grave of the bride herself. At first, there was sound. Behind the growing wall, Margaret's fists pounded. Her screams tore through her throat until they grew ragged, desperate, animal. Every brick seemed to press the cries deeper into the stone, but still they clawed upward, faint echoes rattling the damp ceiling of the cellar. Even the conspirators, hardened men who had rehearsed this moment in their minds, could not pretend they did not hear. Thomas's hands shook as he adjusted his cravat, his skin clammy with sweat. "She will not stop," he whispered, his voice a tremor. Cornelius fixed his son-in-law with a cold, steady stare. "She cannot scream forever." His tone was flat, almost dismissive, as if he were discussing a horse that had to be put down. Edmund swallowed hard, the lantern in his grip swaying with his unease. "The sound carries," he muttered. "What if someone above—" Cornelius cut him off sharply. "No one above hears. These walls were built for this. Do your part and hold your tongue." But the truth, even through limestone 3 feet thick, even with the music swelling above, fragments of Margaret's cries seeped through. A sharp ear might have caught them in the stillness between songs, like the faint wail of wind through cracks in the earth. And so the conspirators knew. They must return upstairs quickly. They must drown her voice with music, with laughter, with wine poured until every guest was deaf to suspicion. Brackenridge laid the final smear of mortar across the last brick, his trowel scraping with mechanical precision. Then he wiped his hands on his coat, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. "It is done," he said simply, though his voice trembled as if the words carried a weight too great. For a moment, silence hung in the cellar. Only the muffled thud of Margaret's fists and the faint, breaking rhythm of her cries filled the cold air. Dr. Henley cleared his throat. Final, lay speaking after long silence. "She will last hours," he said quietly. "Perhaps more. The lungs do not fail quickly in confined air." Thomas blanched, his eyes darting toward the wall that now contained his bride. "Hours?" His voice cracked. He had imagined it quick. Final. He had not considered the torment of lingering death. Cornelius silenced them all with a look. "It is over," he said. "Her voice is gone the moment we decide it is. Come. The guests are waiting." And so, like men returning from a prayer, they ascended the stairs one by one. Lantern light gave way to candle glow. Damp air gave way to the warmth of fire. And the muffled cries of Margaret Randolph, buried beneath mortar and stone, were smothered by the surge of fiddles, laughter, and clinking glasses. When Cornelius re-entered the reception hall, he carried himself with practiced calm. Guests turned to him, inquiring politely about the bride's absence. He smiled faintly, the perfect mask, and explained that his daughter had grown faint from the excitement and had retired to rest. A ripple of polite murmurs passed through the crowd, nothing more. It was a believable lie, and none dared question the patriarch of the Randolph estate. Thomas followed soon after, pale and sweating, though he cloaked his nerves in a drunken laugh. Guests clapped him on the back, congratulating the lucky husband, never suspecting that the bride he had just danced with now clawed her nails bloody against limestone. Music swelled louder. Dancers stamped harder. Every cheer, every toast, every drunken roar became another layer of dirt thrown upon the truth. The cellar below groaned with muffled echoes, but above, the illusion of joy was complete. And here lies the heart of horror. Not that Margaret was murdered, but that her murder required no secrecy once the right lie was spoken. The guests, the town, the society of Annapolis, none would question. They would believe what they were told, because belief was easier than confrontation. They would carry on with their plates of duck, their glasses of claret, their gossip and their deals. The music would not stop for one silenced girl. The conspirators had wagered on silence. On the silence of limestone, the silence of society, the silence of a bride erased by men who claimed to know better. And they were right. Margaret's cries faded, muffled into the stone. The fiddles played louder, the boots struck harder. The dance carried on. Above ground, celebration. Below ground, suffocation. Two worlds stacked upon one another, divided by 3 feet of stone. And in that divide, the truth was buried. The wall was not the end. In many ways, it was only the beginning. Margaret Randolph could be entombed in stone, yes, but stone alone could not keep suspicion from seeping into the world above. Death by itself was never enough. What her father and his allies understood, what every conspirator in history understands, is that to truly erase someone, you must murder their name as well as their body. And so, even as the music roared above and Margaret's muffled cries faded into the stone below, the second burial began. At the Randolph estate, a cover story was already prepared. It had been written weeks in advance, rehearsed like a sermon, its phrases polished until they gleamed with credibility. Margaret, they would say, had been stricken with shame. The cause? An affair, a lover, a scandal hidden in shadows. Cornelius Randolph understood society's appetite for gossip. Annapolis thrived on whispers more than it thrived on trade, and nothing spread faster or stuck harder than a woman's disgrace. To claim his daughter had been overtaken by melancholy after the exposure of a lover would explain everything. Her absence, her silence, her death, and the public, hungry for scandal, would devour the lie without ever questioning whether it was true. The guests were the first to be primed. Between dances and feasts, Edmund and Brackenridge began to whisper carefully to selected ears. Poor Margaret. Such delicate nerves. You've heard, haven't you, of the letters? They never named the supposed lover outright, not at first. The lack of detail made the story stronger, inviting speculation, feeding the rumor mill. By the time the last guest staggered from the manor that night, half drunk on brandy and gossip, the seeds had already been sown. Within 3 days, the whispers had spread through Annapolis like fire through dry grass. Margaret Randolph, the beautiful bride, had flown at her own wedding night. Some said she had been caught exchanging letters with a sailor bound for the Indies. Others swore she had been seen walking by the docks in disguise, slipping coins into a stranger's hand. A few whispered that she had confessed her shame directly to Thomas, and that the marriage had collapsed before it began. Every version contradicted the others, yet that was the genius of the plan. Truth becomes irrelevant when the lie is entertaining. People did not ask which version was real. They asked only for more details, more morsels to feast upon. And so the lie multiplied, each telling further, erasing the truth. Meanwhile, Cornelius began his official maneuvers. With Brackenridge's legal help, he drafted documents asserting that Margaret had abandoned her vows and that her inheritance must therefore pass to her husband Thomas. Magistrates signed, clerks stamped, seals were pressed into wax. Paper did what stone could not. It locked Margaret's fortune away, transferring it neatly into the hands of the very man who had watched her suffocate, and the town accepted it. No one asked why a young bride with wealth and beauty would choose shame and disappearance over life. No one asked why her own father spoke of her with such detached sorrow. No one asked why no body was ever presented. Annapolis society preferred the story of scandal to the discomfort of murder. Because here is the dark truth about reputation. Once you destroy it, you no longer need to explain anything else. Margaret could scream until her throat tore raw beneath the stones of Randolph Manor, but above, her voice had already been rewritten. The woman who had cursed her killers was now dismissed as a wayward girl, undone by her own passions. This was the second entombment, the true one, for bodies eventually rot, but reputations once blackened remain stained for centuries. Margaret Randolph had been buried twice, once in limestone, once in lies. And it was the second burial that ensured the first would never be unearthed. But lies have a weight, just as stone does. And the Randolph lie was heavy enough to bend the lives of generations who carried it. The men who signed the cover story did not know it that night, but they had built not just a tomb, but a curse. The first night after the wall was sealed, the Randolph estate seemed unnaturally still. The last guests had departed, leaving the great halls littered with empty glasses, wilting flowers, and forgotten gloves. Servants moved like phantoms, cleaning silently under Cornelius's watchful eye. To them, Margaret was already gone, retired early with nerves, as they were instructed to say. But when dawn broke, Margaret did not appear at breakfast. She did not appear at all. And so the story began to take root. "She has fled," Cornelius said flatly, as though reading from a script. Edmund muttered about disgrace. Thomas, with his actor's precision, delivered the most convincing lie of all: grief. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice broken, his hand trembling as he held a letter no one was allowed to read. He told them it was Margaret's final note. He told them it said she was leaving. He told them he had burned it for her dignity. But not all in the house accepted the lie. Margaret's maid, Sarah, could not. She had dressed her mistress that morning, felt the weighted hem of the gown, seen the terror in Margaret's eyes. She told the kitchen staff that something was wrong, that Margaret would never abandon her without farewell. She told them she had heard muffled noises from below the ballroom floor as the guests danced, and though the servants whispered among themselves, none dared repeat these doubts aloud. In Annapolis society, a servant's suspicions were worth less than the dust they swept. Yet silence has a way of breaking. It began with sounds, low, almost imperceptible at first. In the dead of night, when the house was quiet and then the dogs lay restless, servants reported faint scratching noises from the floorboards above the basement. Once a cook swore she heard a moan while fetching wine, so soft it could have been imagination. Sarah herself claimed she felt vibrations in the wall when she leaned against it, as though something, or someone, was still inside. Cornelius dismissed these stories with contempt. "The house settles," he snapped. "Wood groans, stone shifts, ghosts are for children." But his harshness betrayed something else: fear. He knew the truth, and if the servants were hearing something, then Margaret had not died quietly. But it wasn't just sounds that troubled the conspirators, it was their own minds. Edmund, already weakened by debts and desperation, began drinking heavily. At taverns in Annapolis, he spoke too freely, hinting at family tragedy, dropping words like inheritance and secrecy. Once, drunk beyond reason, he confessed to a companion that he had signed his own sister's tomb. The companion laughed, assuming it was a metaphor, but Edmund sobbed like a child. Dr. Henley fared little better. Patients whispered that his hands now trembled, that he mixed wrong doses, that he muttered to himself when alone. One night he awoke screaming, insisting he had seen Margaret's pale face at the foot of his bed, her lips blue, her eyes fixed upon him. He confessed the vision to Cornelius, who told him never to speak of it again. But the doctor's silence cost him his sanity. And then came the most dangerous whispers of all, those outside the Randolph estate. By the second week, Annapolis was buzzing with contradictions. Some claimed Margaret had run off with a lover. Others swore they had seen her ghost in a white gown near the Severn River. Fishermen said the tide carried strange sounds from the direction of the manor. Sailors swore they saw candles burning in the basement winze. Dows at hours when no servant would be below. Every rumor only deepened the unease. To those who had celebrated at Randolph Manor, the story no longer fit neatly. Why had no body been recovered? Why had Margaret left her maid, her belongings, her jewels? And why did the Randolph family behave not with grief, but with watchful paranoia? The conspirators had sealed Margaret away in stone, but now the cracks were not in the limestone walls, they were in the story itself, and stories, once they fracture, are more dangerous than screams. Because here is the truth: a body can be hidden, but guilt cannot. It leaks through walls, it seeps into whispers, it drips into dreams. And in Annapolis, the lie the Randolphs had so carefully crafted was beginning to rot. The lie spread like a fever, and Annapolis embraced it with the hunger of a starving city. But lies, once loosed, never stay in the shape their creators intended. They grow, they twist, they evolve until they consume both those who believe them and those who spoke them first. By the end of October, Margaret's disappearance was the only subject on the lips of Annapolis society. In drawing rooms, the gentry leaned close, whispering theories with the relish of conspirators. Was she drowned in the Severn River, overcome with shame? Had she run to Baltimore to live under another name? Or had she, as some dared suggest, been spirited away by a foreign lover who would one day return for her? Cornelius listened to these whispers with outward calm, but inside he seethed. The story was meant to silence suspicion, not invite 100 new ones. His daughter's name had become a riddle, and riddles are dangerous things. They invite questions, they keep memories alive. For Thomas, the situation was worse. Annapolis society had been his stage, his illusion, but now he found himself the central character in a scandal too unstable to control. When he appeared in public, women looked at him with pity rather than admiration. Men treated him with the uneasy politeness reserved for those touched by misfortune. His wealth was increasing, yes, but his social standing, the very mask he had built his life upon, was cracking. The lie was making him rich, but it was also poisoning him. And then came the dreams. Thomas began waking at night, drenched in sweat, convinced he could hear scratching beneath the floorboards. More than once he descended into the basement with a lantern, convinced some animal had clawed into the stonework. He would run his hands along the cold walls, reassuring himself that the bricks were intact. But even as his fingers traced the mortar, he could swear he felt faint. Vibrations. Sometimes he swore the stones were warm. The townspeople noticed changes too. Guests who had attended the wedding claimed they could not step foot in the Randolph house without unease. One woman swore she heard a faint cry of father while walking through the ballroom alone. Another claimed that when she placed her hand upon the floor, she felt a faint heartbeat beneath. Servants reported cold drafts in rooms with no windows, and one young boy fled in terror after claiming a pale hand had pressed against the basement window from the inside. These were dismissed, of course, as superstition. The Randolph name was still powerful, and Cornelius would not allow tales of ghosts to circulate freely. But gossip does not need permission. It leaks, it spreads, and soon Annapolis was divided between those who believed Margaret had shamed her family, and those who whispered that something darker, something unspeakable, had happened in Randolph Manor. And herein lies the deeper corruption. Society itself began to protect the lie. The wealthiest families, many of whom owed debts or favors to Cornelius, repeated his version of events with conviction. Margaret's shame became their shield, protecting their own standing. To question it openly was to challenge not just Cornelius, but the entire hierarchy of Annapolis society. And so respectable men and women chose silence over truth. They became accomplices without lifting a finger. This is how corruption works, always, not through grand conspiracies alone, but through the quiet compliance of those who benefit from keeping their eyes shut. Margaret's tomb was not just of stone, it was of silence, built brick by every tongue that repeated the lie, every head that nodded politely, every guest who pretended to believe. But silence cannot last forever. By November, rumors had begun to spread beyond Annapolis. Hants in Baltimore and Philadelphia whispered of the vanished bride and the inheritance that shifted hands too conveniently. Stories crossed the Chesapeake, traveled with sailors, echoed in taverns, and with each retelling, the truth was both buried deeper and dangerously close to being unearthed. Cornelius had thought he had killed his daughter and her fortune in one decisive stroke. But what he had really created was a contagion. A story too dark to vanish, too suspicious to rest. And the more it spread, the more it seemed as if Margaret herself was fighting her way back through the cracks in the wall, one whispered rumor at a time. Guilt is not a sudden storm. It is a slow rot, invisible at first, until it hollows out the beams of a house and leaves it trembling at the slightest wind. And inside Randolph Manor, the rot had begun to spread. Cornelius Randolph, The proud patriarch had expected relief after his daughter was gone. He had expected silence. Instead, he found his every moment consumed by vigilance. At night, he prowled the halls like a jailer, lantern in hand, convinced that servants might stumble upon something they were not meant to find. He checked the basement door again and again, running his fingers across the cold iron lock, muttering that it must remain sealed. His wealth was secured, but peace had abandoned him. For Thomas, the torment took a different form. He was haunted not by silence, but by sound. The scratching in the walls, faint at first, had become unbearable. He heard it in the ballroom when all was still. He heard it in his chambers as he tried to sleep. Sometimes it was a clawing, frantic and sharp. Sometimes it was a slow, dragging scrape, like fingernails pulled against stone by a hand too weak to lift. He told himself it was rats. He told himself it was imagination. But deep inside, he knew it was Margaret. Edmund, the lawyer, suffered most of all. His debts weighed heavily, but not as heavily as the vision that now stalked his waking hours. Twice he arrived at court disheveled, his cravat untied, his eyes bloodshot. Once he collapsed in the street, raving about his niece standing in the crowd, watching him with eyes that never blinked. His colleagues began to whisper that Edmund Randolph was losing his mind. They did not know how close they were to the truth. Dr. Henley's decline was quieter, but no less terrifying. Patients began dying under his care, victims of dosages too strong, hands too unsteady. The doctor had always prided himself on precision, but now he could not control the trembling of his fingers. He confessed privately to Edmund that he could hear Margaret's breathing in his surgery, faint but steady, as though she stood behind him with lungs that had never stopped gasping. Edmund, drunk and broken, told him it was only the sound of his own conscience. But both men knew better. Even William Brackenridge, the magistrate who had sealed the records and signed the papers, was not immune. He began to fear the very law he had twisted. When townsfolk came to him with disputes, he swore their eyes lingered too long on his hands. The hands that had once carried the mason's trowel into the Randolph cellar. At night he dreamed he was trapped in his own courtroom, the walls bricking themselves shut around him as a jury of the dead scratched at the stones. Each man believed he suffered alone, but the truth was simpler. Margaret had not gone quietly. She lived in the cracks of their minds, in the silence between their words, in the shifting shadows of their homes. Whether it was her ghost or simply the unbearable weight of betrayal did not matter. The effect was the same. None of them could escape her. And as their paranoia grew, so did their distrust of one another. Thomas accused Cornelius of taking more than his share. Edmund accused Brackenridge of leaving evidence in the open. Henley accused them all of dragging him into damnation. The alliance that had sealed the wall now threatened to collapse brick by brick under the pressure of suspicion. This is the fate of every conspiracy. It does not hold forever. Fear devours trust, greed devours loyalty, and guilt devours the soul. What Cornelius and his allies had built was not a fortress, it was a prison, and they were the ones locked inside. But the walls of a prison can only hold for so long. Outside, whispers continued to spread. Inside, Margaret's presence pressed heavier with each passing night, and soon something would have to give. The secret could have survived, perhaps, if silence had been absolute, if the conspirators had trusted one another, if the servants had remained obedient, if the town had been content with a scandal and not demanded something more. But silence is never absolute, and in Randolph Manor, silence had begun to betray itself. It began with the servants. Sarah, Margaret's maid, had grown hollow-eyed since the wedding day. She had not spoken openly of what she suspected, but her unease spread like an infection among the household staff. She told them Margaret would never have fled without her jewels, without her personal papers, without even a single farewell. She reminded them of the weighted gown, the strange noises in the cellar, the locked doors. At first, the others told her to hush. No servant could speak against the master, but Sarah persisted, and persistence plants roots. Soon, the kitchen whispered. Soon, the stable boys avoided the cellar. Soon, the butler himself confessed to hearing something he could not explain. Cornelius sensed this shift, and it infuriated him. He lashed out at Sarah, dismissing her to relatives in Baltimore, telling the staff she was unfit with grief. But by then, it was too late. Her doubts had spread, and doubts once planted cannot be uprooted. The servants remained outwardly obedient, but they watched, and watching is the first step toward rebellion. Outside the manor, Annapolis society was restless. Too many inconsistencies gnawed at the lie. Margaret's absence from church services raised questions. Her supposed letters of farewell had never been seen by anyone but Thomas. And most damning of all, no credible witness could place her outside the estate after her disappearance. The city was beginning to whisper what no one dared say aloud, that Margaret Randolph had never left Randolph Manor at all. It was Edmund who made the first real mistake. Drunk and desperate one November night, he staggered into a tavern and began to weep openly in front of a group of sailors. "The wall," he moaned, slamming his fist against the table. "The wall is too thick for her to be heard." The sailors laughed, thinking him mad, but one remembered his words and repeated them the next day at the docks. Within a week, the phrase was circulating across Annapolis. "The wall is too thick." When Cornelius heard of Edmund's slip, his fury was volcanic. He summoned his brother to the manor and demanded silence, threatening to cut him out of the inheritance entirely. Edmund swore to keep quiet, but paranoia gnawed at him now more than ever. He began to fear not only Margaret's ghost, but Cornelius himself. He confided in Dr. Henley that he feared for his life. Henley, already unraveling, agreed that Cornelius was dangerous, and so the cracks widened further. Meanwhile, Thomas felt his grip on his new wealth slipping. Annapolis society no longer courted him as eagerly as before. Businessmen hesitated to strike deals with him, wary of attaching themselves to scandal. Women no longer smiled as he passed, but whispered behind fans. He had gained fortune, yes, but lost the one thing he valued more: status. His resentment toward Cornelius grew, and in his bitterness he began to consider betraying the very man who had secured him everything. And through it all, the house itself seemed to conspire against them. On cold nights, frost bloomed on the basement door in patterns that looked like fingerprints. Guests swore they smelled damp stone and decay in the parlor, though no wine had been uncorked. One evening, a servant carrying coal swore he heard a woman sobbing beneath his feet. He dropped the bucket and fled, never to return. The conspirators had thought they had sealed Margaret forever. Instead, they had built a amber that echoed with her presence, and those echoes were growing louder, slipping into conversations, dreams, and rumors alike. The truth is this: no wall, however thick, can contain guilt forever. Stone cracks, lies unravel, and in Annapolis, the cracks had begun to widen. What none of them realized was this: their greatest enemy was no longer Margaret's ghost, it was each other, and soon one of them would break. There is always one who falters first. In every conspiracy, one tongue grows too heavy, one mind too fragile, one heart too weak to bear the silence. In the case of the Randolphs, it was Edmund. For weeks he had drowned himself in drink, stumbling through Annapolis with red-rimmed eyes and unshaven face. He no longer argued cases with sharp wit in the courts. He slurred, he rambled, he lost. His colleagues whispered of ruin, yet it was not professional disgrace that weighed him down. It was Margaret. He saw her in reflections, pale and accusing. He heard her in the stillness of night, whispering his name with lips that had no breath. His mind, softened by wine, could no longer distinguish between vision and memory. The breaking came one cold evening in December. Edmund had been summoned to dine with a creditor, a merchant eager for payment long overdue. The man pressed him mercilessly, threatening exposure and ruin if the debt was not settled. Cornered and desperate, Edmund blurted what had weighed on him for months. "You do not understand," he hissed across the table. "The fortune is not mine to touch. It is buried in stone, with her, with Margaret, with the wall." The words hung in the air like smoke. The merchant froze. He thought at first it was drunken nonsense, yet the terror in Edmund's eyes betrayed something more. The merchant did not press further that night, but he remembered every syllable. By morning, the tale had begun its quiet march, first to the merchant's wife, then to her friends, then to the taverns where seamen gathered. They embroidered it, of course. Margaret was alive, walled up in her father's cellar, clawing at the stone with bloody fingers. Or she had died long ago and her spirit had cursed the Randolph family, sealing their doom. But no matter the variation, one detail never changed. The wall. The wall is too thick, the people said. She is behind the wall. When word reached Cornelius, his fury knew no bounds. He stormed to Edmund's lodgings, striking his brother across the face, spitting that he had doomed them all. Edmund wept, protesting he had spoken only once in desperation, but once is all it takes. Cornelius ordered him confined to the manor, forbidding him to show his face in town again. He claimed Edmund was ill with fever, a story no one believed. The other conspirators too grew restless. Dr. Henley raged that Edmund's slip would drag them all into ruin. Thomas sneered that Cornelius should never have trusted a weakling. Even Brackenridge, the magistrate, demanded reassurance that no evidence remained should an inquiry arise. The alliance that had begun with toasts and triumph had turned into a nest of snapping jaws. And through it all, the house seemed to laugh at them. Servants refused to descend into the cellar, insisting the noises were louder than ever. A maid fainted upon seeing what she swore was a woman's handprint, damp and red, pressed against the basement wall. One of the dogs escaped the yard, howling as though pursued. When Thomas tried to dismiss these tales as hysteria, even he trembled, for the scratches he had once dismissed as rats had become clearer, sharper, closer. Cornelius swore the matter would be contained. He had silenced his daughter, and he would silence rumour just the same. But he had not understood one thing. Stone could seal a body, but not a story. And Margaret's story was out now, taking shape, growing teeth. The conspirators had bricked her in, but Edmund had loosed her again, not in flesh, but in words. And words, once freed, are far harder to kill. Rumours are like sparks on dry grass, small at first, flickering and uncertain, until suddenly the entire field is ablaze. By the turn of the year, Annapolis was burning with whispers of Margaret Randolph. Every parlour, every tavern, every market stall carried some version of the tale. Margaret had vanished, yes, but not into shame or secrecy. No, she had been swallowed by the house itself. The wall, they said, it is too thick. You cannot hear her, but she is there. The story changed with every telling. In one version, Margaret was alive still, walled up by her father, her screams muffled by limestone. In another, she had been buried with her dowry chest, the clinking of coins heard on winter nights. In still others, her ghost walked the ballroom in her wedding gown, face pale as moonlight, eyes black with betrayal. But always, always, there was the wall. Cornelius attempted to crush the rumours. He threw open his halls to dinner guests, insisting on music, laughter and cards. He paid poets and pamphleteers to pen verses about Margaret's disgraceful elopement. He bribed ministers to speak from the pulpit of her fall from grace. Yet the more he protested, the more people doubted. The louder his voice, the stronger the whispers beneath it. And worse, people had begun to notice the cracks. Servants were dismissed suddenly, always those who spoke too much. Edmund had disappeared entirely, said to be sick, but no one was permitted to see him. Dr. Henley's practice faltered as patients whispered of his shaking hands. And Thomas, once celebrated as the wealthiest newcomer to Annapolis, now found himself avoided at dances. Ladies no longer courted him, gentlemen eyed him with suspicion. His fortune had been built on Margaret's dowry, and fortune built on a grave is a fortune cursed. The pressure mounted one cold January night when the Randolphs hosted a supper to quell the whispers. The tables were heavy with oysters, roast goose and Madeira, the chandeliers blazing with candlelight. Music played, and Cornelius forced a smile that never touched his eyes, but the guests were restless, their laughter brittle. Then came the moment. A young lieutenant, emboldened by wine, raised his glass and asked in too loud a voice, "To Margaret Randolph, wherever she may be, above ground or behind it." The room fell into silence so deep it seemed the candles themselves flickered in fear. Cornelius's face turned the colour of blood. Thomas stammered some joke, Henley dropped his fork, Brackenridge nearly choked on his wine. But the damage was done. A hush fell over the table, and though conversation resumed, it never recovered. Every guest left that night certain of one thing: something was terribly wrong in the Randolph house. After that, suspicion hardened. Neighbors began to watch the manor more closely. Some claimed they saw lantern light in the basement windows at midnight. Others swore they heard sobbing carried across the water from the Severn River. Children dared one another to creep close to the walls and press their ears against the stone. Some returned white-faced, saying they heard scratching. Others claimed to hear faint, desperate prayers. Cornelius doubled his efforts to crush the tale. He threatened lawsuits, ordered the constable to disperse gatherings, even tried to bribe sailors to silence their songs. But it was useless. The story no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Annapolis now, and Annapolis would not let it go. For the first time, the conspirators realized that their greatest danger was not Margaret's ghost, but their neighbor's curiosity. And once curiosity takes hold, it can only lead to discovery. The wall was holding, for now, but the town itself had begun to circle the Randolphs like wolves, waiting for tea. He first stone to crack. The winter of 1796 pressed heavy upon Annapolis, the kind of cold that gnawed at the bones and stripped the trees bare until their branches clawed at the grey sky like skeletal hands. Randolph Manor stood above the frozen river like a fortress of secrets, its windows dark, its halls too quiet. But walls, no matter how thick, cannot hold back truth forever. It began with the servants. Always, it begins with those who see what others ignore. A scullery maid, dismissed suddenly after years of loyal service, confided to her cousin that she had been ordered to scrub the limestone steps in the cellar, not once, but every week. She spoke of faint brown stains that returned no matter how hard she scrubbed, as though the stone itself was bleeding. Her cousin told a friend. The friend told a tavern keeper. By the end of the week, half the docks knew that Randolph Manor's basement bled in winter. The second sign came when a cooper, hired to repair a barrel in the wine cellar, returned pale and silent. He told his wife in whispers that he had heard something, not a sound one expects in a wine cellar, not the shuffle of rats or the settling of stone. No, he swore he heard a woman's nails dragging slowly across limestone, like a message written in agony. He fled before finishing his work, and when Cornelius tried to hire another craftsman, no one in town would come near. But the most damning discovery arrived one bitter February night. A fisherman hauling nets near the bluff beneath Randolph Manor found something tangled in his catch, a shred of white silk, stained dark, with a tiny lead weight sewn into the hem. The silk was unmistakable. Annapolis had seen that gown, Margaret's gown. The fisherman carried it to the tavern instead of the magistrate, knowing full well that official channels were already compromised. By morning, every man on the docks had touched that piece of silk, felt the hidden weight, smelled the river damp still clinging to it. Word spread like a fever. Margaret had not run away. Margaret had not eloped. Margaret had been weighted down, sealed up, erased by those who stood to profit from her disappearance. The story grew teeth. And as rumors hardened into certainty, something strange began to happen. The townsfolk began to visit Randolph Manor under cover of night. Men carried lanterns and pressed their ears to the limestone walls. Women left flowers at the edge of the bluff, whispering prayers for Margaret's soul. Children dared one another to knock on the cellar door, then fled shrieking when echoes answered back. The Randolphs had meant to bury her memory, but in their attempt, they had made her eternal. Inside the house, the conspirators were unraveling. Thomas's hands shook so violently he could barely lift a glass. Dr. Henley began to drink opium tinctures himself, muttering of Margaret's eyes, watching him in his sleep. Edmund, his debts crushing him, begged Cornelius to release him from the pact. Brackenridge avoided the house entirely, terrified that his position could not shield him from the truth forever. And Cornelius was no longer the master of Randolph Manor. He was its prisoner. He spent hours pacing the cellar, pressing his hands against the cold limestone, listening. He had begun to hear it too, at first faint, like wind slipping through cracks, then louder. A voice, Margaret's voice, calling his name, laughing when he begged for silence. The wall had not silenced her, it had only given her permanence. The conspiracy was cracking stone by stone. All it would take was one man brave enough or foolish enough to strike the wall with a hammer, and Annapolis was full of men who had nothing left to lose. The night of March 4th, 1797 was the kind of night Annapolis would never forget. The air was raw with salt and cold. The moon, a pale, merciless coin, hung above the Severn River. A crowd gathered outside Randolph Manor, not with torches and pitchforks, but with something far more dangerous: silence. They came in twos and threes, fishermen and dockworkers, widows and servants, their faces shrouded by scarves and cloaks. No leader had called them, no priest had summoned them. It was Margaret who had summoned them, through whispers, through fragments of silk and bloodstains that would not wash away. By midnight, nearly 40 souls stood at the edge of the bluff, lanterns dimmed, eyes fixed on the house that crouched above them like a predator. And among them was a man with nothing to lose. His name was Elias Brandt, a blacksmith whose daughter had once served in the Randolph kitchen. She had been dismissed in disgrace, accused of theft, her reputation ruined. She swore that Cornelius himself had planted the evidence, that he had used her as a scapegoat. Elias had never forgiven the humiliation. Tonight, the whispers had driven him to the brink. He carried a hammer in one hand and an iron chisel in the other. The crowd followed him to the cellar doors. They were locked, of course, but Elias's hammer made quick work of that. The first strike echoed across the bluff like a cannon shot. Inside, the conspirators froze. Cornelius, sitting in his study with a glass of brandy, felt the vibration through the floorboards. Thomas spilled his wine. Henley muttered a curse. They knew instantly. The town had come for the wall. Elias led the way down the narrow stone steps, lantern light dancing against damp limestone. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the smell of earth and mildew. The others followed, some whispering prayers, others silent, their breath fogging in the lantern glow. And then they reached it. The wall. Perfectly mortared, smooth, almost too clean compared to the rough stone around it. A wall that did not belong. Elias pressed his ear against it. For a long moment, nothing. Only the faint drip of water somewhere deep in the cellar. The crowd held its breath. Then it came. A sound so faint that half of them thought it imagined. A whisper, thin as thread. A woman's voice, saying one word again and again. Help! Gasps rippled through the cellar. Some fell to their knees. Others fled up the steps, unable to bear it. Elias did not move. His hand trembled as he lifted the chisel, set it against the mortar and raised the hammer. But before the strike could fall, a shout rang out. Stop! Cornelius himself appeared at the top of the steps, lantern blazing, face twisted with rage. Thomas and Henley flanked him, pale and sweating. Brackenridge, shaking, followed behind, clutching a pistol he barely knew how to hold. Cornelius's voice thundered across the cellar. You dare trespass in my house? You dare desecrate these walls with your lies? The crowd froze, torn between fear of the magistrate's pistol and the weight of the voice behind the wall. Elias lowered his hammer, but only slightly. His eyes never left Cornelius. This wall, Elias said, his voice rough as iron, does not belong to you. It belongs to her, and we will tear it down, with or without your blessing. The standoff hung in the air like the edge of a blade. Every second stretched into eternity. The conspirators trembled, knowing that if the first stone fell, the truth would spill out like blood. Cornelius raised his hand, signaling Brackenridge to fire. But Brackenridge hesitated. His face was white, his pistol shaking. He too had heard the whisper. He too feared what lay beyond the stone. For the first time since October, the conspirators realized they were no longer in control. The wall would not protect them much longer. And Margaret, whether living or dead, was about to speak. Panic is the great unmasker. For months, Cornelius Randolph and his circle had wrapped themselves in poise, in wealth, in the illusion of control. But on that March night, in the damp chill of the Randolph cellar, their masks cracked. Cornelius's voice roared, but it was the roar of a cornered beast, not a master. Leave this place or face the law, he shouted, lantern shaking in his hand. Yet the crowd did not move. They had seen too much. They had heard the voice. No law could erase that. Elias Brandt stood firm, hammer in hand. His eyes burned with years of bitterness, and in that glow the others found courage. One by one, men and women stepped forward. Dockhands, sailors, housewives with dirt still under their fingernails. Not warriors, not rebels, but ordinary souls who had decided the wall must come down. Thomas Carrington, his face ashen, leaned toward Cornelius and whispered hoarsely, "If they break it, we are finished." Cornelius's jaw tightened. He knew. Every conspiracy hangs by threads of secrecy, and theirs had frayed too thin. He glanced to Brackenridge, the pistol in his hand wavering like a reed in the wind. The magistrate's eyes were hollow, his mouth twitching. He was not going to fire. Cornelius could see it. The man was already lost to fear. It was then Cornelius made his choice. Desperation breeds cruelty. He raised his lantern high and barked an order to Thomas and Henley, "Seize Brandt, now!" They lunged. The cellar erupted into chaos. Thomas grabbed for Elias's arm, but the blacksmith swung his hammer with the fury of a man betrayed, catching Thomas's shoulder and sending him sprawling. Henley, trembling and clumsy, lunged at another man instead, only to be shoved to the floor. The lantern fell, shattering against the stones, flames licking at spilled wine on the floor. Smoke began to rise, thick and acrid. Screams filled the cellar as Sawney Haddows danced wild against the limestone. People rushed for the stairs, yet in the madness, Elias did not retreat. He planted his feet before the wall, hammer raised high once more. He struck. The sound was deafening. Stone cracked, mortar flaked. A gasp rippled through the crowd as dust spilled from the seam. One strike, and the illusion of permanence was broken. Cornelius bellowed like a madman, lunging toward Elias with his bare hands, but the crowd surged between them. Women clawed at his coat, men shoved him back. For the first time, the Randolph patriarch felt powerless in his own house. And then, through the smoke, through the screams, came another sound, clearer now, undeniable. A voice, faint but steady, rising from behind the wall. "Father." The word froze everyone. It was not wind. It was not trickery. It was Margaret. Her voice, carrying from the stones, echoing in every guilty ear. Thomas stumbled backward, face pale as death. Henley clutched his head, muttering that he had dosed her too much, that it was impossible. Brackenridge dropped the pistol altogether, retreating up the steps as if chased by fire. Cornelius staggered, his eyes wide, the world spinning around him. He could not speak. The name, his name on her lips, was heavier than any hammer. The crowd pressed forward, shouting for more blows, urging Elias to finish what he had begun, but the flames were spreading, smoke thickening, choking their lungs. The cellar was becoming a trap. Cornelius saw his final chance. "Block the stairs," he roared to Thomas. "Trap them here. Burn it all if we must." It was the last card of desperate men, to drown evidence in fire and ash. If the wall fell, so too would their names. Better the house burn than the truth live. But Elias raised his hammer again, coughing through smoke, eyes locked on the wall. "Better the house burn," he shouted, "than the truth. Stay buried." And he struck again. The wall trembled. Dust poured. Margaret's voice grew louder, and the conspirators, once architects of destiny, now felt time itself turning against them. The third strike shattered more than stone. It shattered illusion. Mortar cracked open like a wound, and cold air spilled through the cellar, carrying with it a smell that made every stomach twist, rot, damp, and something unmistakably human. The crowd staggered back, some gagging, others crossing themselves, but Elias did not flinch. With one last roar, he drove the hammer down. The wall groaned, stones loosened, and then collapse. A section crumbled outward, spilling dust and shards across the cellar floor. Lantern light pierced the dark hollow beyond, and what it revealed froze every voice in the room. There she was, Margaret, or what was left. Her gown, once white silk, hung in tatters, shredded by desperate hands. The lead weight still pulled at the fabric, though it clung now to nothing but bone. Her fingers, skeletal, clutched at the inner wall, nails broken and bloodied where she had clawed until the last breath left her lungs. And her face. God, her face. Hollow sockets where eyes had been, jaw frozen in a scream that had never been heard. The cellar went silent. The only sound was the crackle of fire licking the spilled wine, the whispers of flame echoing Margaret's final agony. Cornelius fell to his knees. His lantern hand trembled, and for the first time, the patriarch looked like a man, not a master, not a conspirator, just a father who had murdered his own blood. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. Then a single cry rose from the crowd, raw and shaking. Justice. Others joined. The cellar filled with voices, louder than the fire, louder than the ghost of Margaret's scream. The wall had fallen, and with it, the Randolph legacy. The cellar shook not from fire, but from fury. 40 voices, once hushed by fear, now thundered with rage. Justice, they cried, justice for Margaret, justice for the silence, justice for every secret buried in stone. Cornelius staggered to his feet, arms outstretched, choking on smoke and shame. "You don't understand," he began, but the words drowned in the roar. No one wanted his explanations. No one cared for his excuses. His power, his fortune, his carefully woven influence, all of it burned away in the light of Margaret's bones. Thomas tried to flee. He shoved through the crowd, desperate for the stairs, but Elias caught him by the collar and hurled him back into the cellar dust. "You sealed her in," Elias growled, voice like iron striking iron. "You sealed your own grave." Henley collapsed against the wall, muttering, rocking, clutching his head as if Margaret's whispers gnawed his sanity. Brackenridge had already fled, his pistol abandoned, his cowardice exposed to all. The crowd surged forward. Hands seized Cornelius, Thomas, Henley, dragging them not toward escape but toward judgment. For centuries courts had failed the people of Annapolis, but here, in this fire-lit cellar, the people would not fail Margaret. "Seal them!" someone shouted. "Seal them as they sealed her!" The cry spread like flame. Men lifted stones from the broken wall. Women tore cloth from gowns to bind wrists. The cellar became a tribunal of rage, a chamber of reckoning. The conspirators pleaded, clawed, begged, but the voices of the living drowned beneath the demand of the dead. Margaret's bones had spoken, and now the town would answer in kind. The fire crept higher, smoke thickened, and in that choking darkness, judgment fell swift, merciless, and final. The cellar became a tomb of its own making. Smoke curled along the ceiling, stones glowed with heat, and the mob's fury reached its fever pitch. Cornelius fought like a man drowning, clawing at the hands that dragged him toward the broken wall. His voice cracked as he screamed, not for mercy but for control. "I am Randolph. I am master here." Yet the title meant nothing now. To the people he was only a murderer, a father who had chosen ambition over blood. Thomas sobbed openly, his powdered wig askew, his once velvet coat torn and smeared with soot. "I begged him," he cried. "I told him it was madness." But no plea could erase the stains of his silence. Silence, the crowd knew, was complicity. Henley fared worst of all. He collapsed before Margaret's bones, wailing that her eyes still watched him, that her breath still lingered in his dreams. The mob seized him with disgust, shoving his frail body toward the stones he had sworn were airtight. One by one they were forced into the hollow where Margaret had perished. Elias himself hefted the first stone, slamming it back into place with a force that made the walls quake. Others followed, men and women working in grim rhythm, sealing the conspirators as the fire lit their faces. Cornelius's final roar echoed through the cellar, rage curdling into terror as the opening shrank. Thomas whimpered prayers. Henley shrieked until smoke stole his breath. Then stone sealed silence. The mob stood back, chests heaving, eyes wide. No judge had presided. No gallows had been built. Justice had been rendered by their own hands, swift as Margaret's voice demanded. When the fire grew too fierce, they fled the manor, leaving it to collapse into itself. By dawn, Randolph Manor was a smouldering ruin, and from that ruin, a story was born. By sunrise, Randolph Manor was nothing but blackened stone and smoking ash. The great house that once loomed above Annapolis, symbol of wealth and control, had crumbled into ruin. Its masters lay sealed behind a wall of their own making, entombed with the daughter they betrayed. The town gathered on the bluff that morning, silent as the river mist curled around their feet. No magistrate came, no militia intervened. What had happened in that cellar was no crime, no riot. It was judgment, delivered by the very people who had lived too long beneath the shadow of the Randolphs. Margaret's remains were carried out carefully, wrapped in white linen by women whose tears fell freely. She was buried not in the Randolph plot, but in the churchyard among common folk. Her grave bore no title, no crest, only a simple stone etched with her name and the words, "She spoke, and we listened." In the years that followed, children dared each other to climb the ruins at night, whispering that Margaret's voice still echoed through the stones. Sailors swore that lanterns flickered by the bluff, even when no hands carried them, and whenever the wind blew through the charred timbers, townsfolk claimed it carried the faintest sound of nails scratching against limestone. The Randolph fortunes scattered, their estates seized or abandoned. No historian bothered to record their end in official ledgers, but the people remembered, not as gossip, not as rumor, but as warning. For in Annapolis it was said, "Walls may hide secrets, but stones never forget." And Margaret's wall, though broken, remained in every telling, eternal as the river itself. The Randolph name rotted away. Margaret's, however, endured. A whisper turned legend. A victim turned judge. Forever.